Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on passkeys in the public sector. My name is Joel McConvey, and I'm here for Biometric Update. And I'm here to host a discussion with Megan Shamas of the FIDO Alliance and Jeremy Grant, Managing Director of Technology and Business Strategy for Venable LLP. We're going to have a bit of a chat first for a while, and then we'll probably take a few questions from participants if time permits. So Megan, Jeremy, thank you both for coming.
Oh, thanks for having me.
As our sort of summary says for this webinar, passkeys are bringing passwordless authentication at an unprecedented rate, introducing a wave of new users to the work of the FIDO Alliance, which aims to rid the world of passwords. At the same time, fraud techniques are getting better thanks to generative AI, making secure authentication more important than ever. So how do we address this challenge? Megan, I think I'll start with you. If you can maybe give us the sort of high-level overview, what are passkeys in brief, and why do, in the context of this webinar, why are they something governments should be paying attention to?
Yeah, thanks, Joel. So if you're familiar with FIDO Alliance or FIDO credentials, passkeys are really just a term for passwordless FIDO credentials. And what that means is that, passkeys provide fast, easy, and importantly, phishing resistant passwordless authentication. So there's two important pieces. You can replace passwords finally with something that can be scaled, can be scalable, and it can be phishing resistant. So a first factor that is phishing resistant and also can meet requirements for multi-factor authentication as well. So that is, what is really the game changer about passkeys. And the way that you leverage them from a user experience, that's why I lead with the fast and easy sign-ins. Phishing resistance is something that FIDO credentials have always been. Signing in with FIDO has always been phishing resistant. I'll get back to that in a minute, but the fast and easy part of it is what really is driving the mass adoption that we're seeing, because it becomes an area of sort of ROI for folks that are providing services. Getting folks to where they want to go, which is signing in. They don't want to be burdened, right? So getting in faster and easier, and if it's a government service, for example, gets them to accomplish their task much more quickly. And the way that you sign in with passkeys is just the way you would unlock your device today. It's through your smart device, like a local biometric or local PIN, or you can leverage what many of you may have heard of as a FIDO security key, or maybe have used in the government arena. And many governments today are using passkeys for e-citizen services, as well as for employee access. So those are the two areas where folks can look at leveraging passkeys, whether it's for e-citizen services or internally for employees and contractors. So I would look at it from both perspectives. And then the generative AI that you mentioned, Joel, it's incredible what we're seeing in terms of the ability to perpetuate phishing attacks and do it in social engineering in a way that is very successful, right? So it's no longer, an email from the prince in Nigeria. These are like very well honed in on attacks. And what passkeys do is really take the burden off of the user to have to identify those sorts of attacks, because passkeys simply cannot be given away to a nefarious person. And for those reasons, governments like the quick, easy, also the phishing resistance is, why they're actively looking at it. Many have actually deployed or should be looking at it today.
Excellent, thank you. Governments aren't typically often associated with fast, easy processes, depending. But obviously security is a major issue. Jeremy, maybe you could speak a bit more to the, what's the drivers behind this? What's pushing governments towards passkeys, and how do they fit into kind of overall business and zero trust strategies for these public organizations?
Yeah, I think it's a good point you just made, by the way, that, not only are governments not typically associated with, being fast and easy, but they also tend not to be early adopters when it comes to, say, new security technology. And what has stood out to me about passkeys, and in fact, maybe even surprised me a little bit in a pleasant way, is that we are seeing governments across the globe embrace them for, what I would call citizen-facing services, citizen-facing portals, at a pretty rapid clip in some pretty high-profile programs. Just, in the US, login.gov, which is the federal government's not only approach for single sign-on, but, one of the primary ones supports Passkeys, as do some of the private vendors like ID.me. Over in EU, the EU login system, which is sort of a similar portal for different services, now supports Passkeys. We've had an announcement from both the Australian team that's running their MyGov portal and Singapore, who has SingPass. We'll be talking about what Michigan has done today at their state level portal. It's really remarkable for a technology, to me, that's honestly still kind of new, to be seeing, this kind of adoption at scale. I think what's driving a lot of it is really a combination of better user experience and better security. On the user experience side, look, nobody likes passwords. I mean, they're basically the worst combination of security and usability you could imagine, that they're terrible on both. And I think for years, we've had efforts with a lot of legacy types of multi-factor authentication, where you're basically doing a password and then you have a second factor as well. Basically, that second factor is trying to cover up for the inherent weaknesses of passwords by layering something else on top of it. Well, the only thing that makes a user experience worse than a password is a password and then having to grab an SMS code that you then have to, hand type in, and it's only good for 30 seconds, or, get one of those codes from your app. And on the security side, all of those things are now phishable these days. Just like we've seen adversaries figure out how to, phish even the most complex of passwords. Look, if I can trick you into clicking a link and typing in your 14-character password that meets all sort of requirements for entropy that honestly don't really matter in the security space anymore, because I can just phish it. I can also phish that one-time passcode from you. Or if you're getting a push notification in an app, I can probably trick you into, if you think you're dealing with a real user, you'll click approve. And so I think the benefits are quite obvious in that passkeys are inherently more secure than passwords. They're more secure than passwords when paired with other legacy MFA. And so this is what's really driving a lot of adoption. I think you also get bonus points because you're seeing for organizations that do implement passkeys, they suddenly see the calls to their help desk often go down because now nobody's doing password resets anymore. So all of those things I think are driving adoption. The last point I would make is we're also seeing policies from governments start to be adopted to encourage things like passkeys. Back in 2022, the White House Zero Trust Strategy, which governed federal agencies, made clear that you have to use phishing-resistant authentication in the enterprise every place, and it has to at least be an option for citizen-facing services. And so you now have a policy overlay. That's just one example of some of the things that we've seen that's also driving adoption.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and I don't know, Jeremy, if you agree with this, but part of the kind of fast pace of adoption, like Australia, for example, is a great example, is sort of the availability piece and the ease of which like deployment can happen. It's not like such a huge technical lift to deploy passkeys as it might appear. I mean, it's available on every major computing device, and in terms of like doing the work to actually roll it out is really more, and I think we're going to talk about this a little later, is really more about the awareness and the education around the folks that are doing the signing in than the actual like technical implementation of it.
So given that, Megan, it's an interesting point that passkeys are not, a huge technical lift for many organizations. It seems that, the lift might be more on the policy side and on the side of, okay, we're ready to embrace this new technology. So if I can ask both of you, what are, in your experience, what are governments looking for when it comes to kind of their larger identity strategies, and how can FIDO in particular help support what they're looking for in those strategies and with those kinds of approaches?
So I'd say, part of my role at Venable is serving as an advisor to FIDO, helping them with government engagement across the globe. And for those who know me, I've spent time in government as well in a couple stints. I think governments honestly want the same things that private sector organizations want. They want their authentication to be easy. Ideally, it's cheap. It should be secure, and ideally has a really good user experience. So I think the easy part people get. We're now enabling passwordless authentication, which is a heck of a lot easier than trying to deal with the password. One of the things I think we're seeing that's becoming an issue on the affordability side is I think in part because of the reliance we've had on SMS over the years, you've now seen a lot of, basically scam rings, basically that, try to, pump as many SMS charges as they can. Not so much in the US, but we see this in foreign countries sometimes. They'll often be in cahoots with like the local mobile network operator to be conspiring to jam more and more SMS text through. So, between the very weak security that SMS gives you anyways as a second factor, and then we have one FIDO member, I can't say who they are other than it's a, big brand name company you'd recognize, who was talking about in one country, they were dealing with a couple $1 million of bogus SMS charges a month, dealing with the consumer base there. And that was in a country that was only of around 5 million people. So from an affordability standpoint, getting away from SMS to something that doesn't involve those kind of a cost, like the savings really can pile up quite quickly.
Well, that makes sense. Megan, do you have any thoughts on sort of the larger government perspective? And I'm curious actually too, if people know FIDO. I mean, if you are a familiar and well-known presence to governments across the country.
Yeah, well, I was going to just add to what Jeremy Jeremy does a lot of great work to help educate governments globally around, why FIDO represents sort of a different paradigm from what they're used to when it comes to authentication. And with Passkeys, like, doing a, replacing a password and saying, we can provide the same levels of security with a passkey or better than a multiple factor scenario. It requires kind of a rethink of how you look at authentication internally. Not necessarily just from for a compliance perspective, it's not what people are used to when they think about authentication and security, because they're used to factor upon factor upon factor upon factor. And so some of that is sort of a re-education of, just what FIDO is providing and why they might need to rethink, what they've typically done. And that is, a kind of a huge thing that, most governments, even if it's from a policy perspective or their own implementation perspective, have to get over that kind of a hump. And we're just trying to assist with that as much as possible. And hopefully governments will continue to recognize this, as like NIST has, for example, which I think, we can get into a little bit later. But, there is definitely an appetite for understanding of this, but there needs to be kind of some rewrites of, the way that we've typically handled MFA, if you will.
Yeah, and I'd say in terms of government recognition, I mean, it's been a real transformation in the time I've been involved with, FIDO Alliance from, I think a few years ago, we'd be going into countries across the globe and, the assumption was everything was, one-time passcodes or PKI or legacy things, and people didn't know what FIDO was. Now, I think not only is it an anomaly if you're dealing with the government and not at least aware of FIDO, but increasingly we're seeing across the globe, FIDO is being called out as the preferred authentication method, particularly because you're seeing governments focus on the importance of phishing-resistant authentication. Now, does that mean your average, user in a state knows what FIDO is or has heard of FIDO? Probably not. But I think what we are seeing is a lot of them are very focused on they're hearing about Passkeys right now. I mean, just anecdotally, conversations I get hanging out with, elderly cousins who said, "Oh, I was asked about a passkey the other day. Don't you work in cybersecurity?" Like, people are getting, what this is. And I think for something that was only really launched in earnest as a name, about 2 years ago, it's been really rapid adoption and recognition.
Let's talk about Michigan, because that's a recent successful implementation there of Passkeys with the My Login system. So can you tell us what the results they've seen with that implementation, and maybe if, building on that, if there are any other use cases you can share, or any big plans in motion with governments that you've on a local or state level that either of you have been made aware of?
Yeah, it's been great to see Michigan in the lead here at the state level, and not just because it's my home state. Behind me, you'll see lovely beaches of northern Michigan on Lake Michigan, Michigan Stadium, truly cherished, special place in my heart. But I had nothing to do with actually getting Michigan to do this. They were wise enough, as you might expect, on their own to find their way to Passkeys. And Michigan's also been great in that they actually worked with us on a case study to share some of sort of their journey to Passkeys and how they got there, and some of the lessons learned from it. So my login, just as level setting, is basically the sign-in portal, the identity portal for the Michigan state government. It supports access to more than 360 applications and services spread across 18 different agencies in the government. It's basically the portal for the state if you need to get services. And it's supporting, I think they said, more than 12 million users and about 700,000 business partners who also have to log in. So their core drivers are really the three that I mentioned before: better user experience, drive down help desk costs, and improve security. And I think talking to their CTO's office and their CIO, and they've been great also getting out on the speaking circuit, like at the NASCIO conference earlier this spring, to talk about things. I think they were really attracted to Passkeys. One, they said FIDO2 is an open standard. It's supported by a lot of different vendors, and it's designed from the start to prioritize user privacy. So certainly if you're really, if you're working on a public sector application, all of those things are pretty important. I think one of the things they've done in Michigan that I think is also going to be an aid to other states or just any government agencies or even some private sector ones as they look to use Passkeys is some of the work that they've done just in terms of figuring out where in the whole user journey to prompt users to create Passkeys. And this can be tricky, especially for somebody who doesn't know what it is. They don't understand the technology. I mean, we have issues where there's a portion of the population, this may sound absurd to those of us who work in security, but we've been conditioning people for so long to think that they need a long, strong password and that it means anything, that if you tell them they can go passwordless, some people think it means less security, which is obviously insane, but it takes a long time to get people, caught up on things. So, they basically come up with a simple prompt. You've already logged in, we know who you are, and they will say, oh, it looks like you're eligible to go passwordless going forward. Would you like to do that? And they're seeing, pretty good adoption. Some key stats, they said they're averaging about 18,000 new enrollments a month, which, relative to everybody they've got isn't a ton, but it's not like that many people in the state are going to the state every month to log in. They, have said there's basically zero issues reported in terms of passwordless enrollment or passwordless access by users. And, with this, their help desk numbers have gone down in terms of what, they need to do with password resets by nearly 2/3. They've also seen their login abandonment rate go down. This is another problem with passwords is, crap, I forgot it, or I entered something too many times and I got locked out. They've seen login abandonment go down by 73% over the last year, which is also an amazing number when you think about, and I think we've seen this with a lot of private sector partners as well. When you think about how many people abandon a transaction because they don't have an easy way to log in, like it's real money being lost, or in the case of government services, real service opportunities being lost. In terms of, other states potentially doing this, Michigan's the one I know of. One thing I have seen though is states love to copy each other when one of them leads on something that's innovative and good. And, in the CIO community, I think it's safe to say what Michigan's done is getting some good attention.
Excellent.
I want to make a point about, so those statistics are tremendous. When you talk about like actually generating revenue, okay, maybe you're just like decreasing costs associated with authentication, like that is a misnomer, like that is not a thing that people are used to. But what's really actually amazing about what Jeremy just shared is that Michigan wants to share that with the public, right? And so this is something so I've been doing marketing for FIDO Alliance since 2016. And what I know is that it was very hard to get any service, whether it's a consumer service, any kind of service, to even tell you what their MFA opt-in rate was. I think one company did it, and it was Twitter, and it was like 2%. And like no one else would say, because guess what? It was probably less than 2%. And now it's not just Michigan. I have a whole database of ROI type statistics that these companies are just like clamoring to provide because they're so happy with their implementation. And I don't just say, like, they really are. And the data speaks for itself, but the fact that these folks are willing to share data related to any sort of security improvement that they've made is really like a huge testament to like how well it's going for them. Because that's really a rare thing to get companies to share that kind of data.
I want to talk a bit about that kind of transparency and the idea of governments having to communicate to people this kind of change. We have a brief comment or question from the field. Why is Michigan always so much better than everyone else at everything? I would suggest they maybe haven't been watching the Pistons recently, but you know, Jeremy, I'm sure you can speak to Michigan's many charms.
Yeah, I see who asked that question, and it's a fellow Wolverine. So I appreciate the loaded question. But
in terms of you know, shepherding people into this experience, though, one of the things I've found in learning about Passkeys is the pitch is amazing. You know, passwordless, less friction, more secure. But it's a little trickier once you start getting under the hood and people start asking, well, what's actually going on here? And then you have to explain the cryptography and the public and private key and these sorts of things. And I wonder if just how much of a challenge you find that to be in terms of communicating, okay, especially with government where people want trust. You know, this is what this is, and this is why we understand why it's beneficial, but this is what it is, and this is why it's beneficial.
Yeah, so we have actually an entire working group within the FIDO Alliance that's dedicated to the user experience of Passkeys and addressing things like that, right? So we have, you know, 30 to 40 UX experts from major companies all over the globe that are working on this, but we also do research with real consumers, real, you know, citizens around these experiences and what resonates and what doesn't. And we have, you know, design guidelines that can be leveraged, you know, by anyone that's deploying Passkeys that are available on our website. But that's backed by research. And I attend, you know, a lot of these research sessions, and it's honestly like very eye-opening, you know, the things that resonate and the things that don't. And, you know, Jeremy mentioned this earlier, but folks, like, maybe they don't love the password experience, but they're used to using passwords. And some of the terminology that you use when you're prompting for your users to enroll a passkey, I mean, that language is really important. And what we found is actually, you know, using things like get rid of your password or, you know, things like that actually are not, you know, what they want to hear, because they're kind of holding on to that like a security blanket. But things like, okay, you know, you just signed in and, you know, hey, do you want to sign in more easily and faster next time? This is, you know, enroll on a passkey. And then sort of the things that we found in terms of, you know, the security part of it is, you know, you're going to have a mix of folks. Some people want to dig in deeper and some just don't. And so, you know, there are some recommendations of how to deal with that in our guidelines as well. So the way that, of course, you know, passkeys are quick and easy, but you have to get folks to to enroll. And this is a fundamentally kind of new thing. The operating system will pop up, right? It's very much akin to like a password manager experience, where, you know, your operating system's popping up. You're like, whoa, like I wasn't, you know, expecting that. And so some of the things like how to prime your users are part of that as well. And then I'll say one last thing, which is, you know, some of the ways that folks are rolling this out is, and what we have in our guidelines is, hey, you know, when you first start, you know, you might not want to, you know, prompt. You might want to like pop up, you know, a thing after they sign in, right? Because like I said earlier, they're there to do something, which is not to work on their authentication necessarily. It probably isn't. But what if they're having pain in that flow? They forgot their password. They're going through a reset process. Hey, you should prompt them there. Or, you know, hey, they just signed in with a SMS OTP, which we all know, nobody likes that. Prompt them there. So it's sort of meeting them where they're at when they're doing things relating to authentication, not when they're trying to do the thing that they're, you know, trying to do, whether it's a citizen service or whatever, as like a first step. And then others might move to prompting after sign in. But that is kind of like one of the key learnings that from our research around how to get folks enrolled.
And Joel, I'd say to your point, look, the folks who are implementing it, they obviously understand the benefits of asymmetric public key cryptography, but God forbid we ever are asking any consumers to even take the time to contemplate that phrase. I think we're probably losing. And so this, certainly has been a challenge at times is, how do you explain why it's better and why it's more secure without getting into the technical details? Because people's eyes can start to glaze over really quickly if you get into that topic. I think, we're still learning a lot on this front, but again, with the early adoption that we're seeing across the globe, in both public and private sector, I will say it seems to be working.
This is a good segue into a question about sort of what's next. We've seen recently, most recently, I think MasterCard, this huge credit card company, payments company, adopt Passkeys. They're aiming for full tokenization of Europe by 2030, I believe. And then you've got government deployments as well. So where do you see this all going? Do you think it's going to be the private sector that really kind of normalizes it for the majority of people? Do you think it's going to filter into government first? What's how do you see passkey adoption progressing in the next few years as they continue to kind of replace the password system?
I mean, my take is I don't know if you're going to see one sector surge ahead of the other. I mentioned earlier I was, a little pleasantly surprised by how many major government services already have embraced it. And we're obviously seeing that with, commercial facing sites as well. I will say there's a bit of a, what people would call a virtuous circle with government, being out in front on this, in that often a question, we'll get from industries as well, we'll do this, but what will the regulators think? And so I think seeing a combination of policies across the globe that say phishing resistant authentication is a priority, look to things like FIDO, and then seeing governments use it themselves. When I was in government years ago, one of the questions as we were trying to prompt the private sector to embrace better identity solutions was, well, if we do this, is the government going to eat its own dog food? And that was a bigger challenge at a time with bigger things like credential service providers, from third parties. But in the authentication front, I mean, government's eating it all across the globe and, has great stories to tell. And so I do think that is helping folks in the private sector get a little bit more comfort with it as well.
Megan, do you have
Yeah,
any thoughts?
I agree. I see this is I'm stealing this from Andrew Shakiar, who's our CEO, but passkeys are inevitable. Like this is happening. It's not, we're going to see passkeys rolled out en masse over the next, several years. And it will be, things consumers are just super used to. I think that is, we're definitely going to see that. And what you mentioned about MasterCard though is really interesting, because what we're seeing now is, organizations like that looking at different use cases for passkeys. So that is a payment authorization use case, which is not a sign-in use case, but it's a perfect use case for passkeys because of the speed, the ease, the phishing resistance over things that you see in like 3DS, which is, kind of a frictionful experience for consumers when they're just trying to buy something online. So I think we're going to see more of that. We had a seminar in Munich that was centered around leveraging FIDO and passkeys around like the automotive space and things that are happening within that space. Mm-hmm. So I think we're definitely going to see that, adoption on the sign-in screen inevitably. And then, we'll see like where are passkeys going to fit into your everyday life in different use cases that maybe you hadn't really thought of too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think on that front, another thing that is definitely driving some adoption, and we're also seeing some novel uses of passkeys, is addressing concerns about generative AI and deepfakes, where in addition to helping craft better sort of perfectly worded pixel perfect phishing attacks, we're also at a point where a lot of systems can spoof a face, a video, a photo, a voice pretty convincingly. And, while there are tools that are out there that can, leverage liveness detection to defend against that. In fact, FIDO separately just launched a certification program for some of the selfie match components that are used in remote ID proofing to test for not only accuracy, but also liveness and bias. I think kind of everybody's gathering, or coming around to the idea that we're going to be in an arms race with these adversaries, and the technology is going to be advancing very quickly. And there's a lot of players who just aren't going to be able to, try and keep up with where the adversaries are. So one of the things that I think is interesting about Passkeys is, look, generative AI can spoof a lot of biometrics, but it cannot spoof public key cryptography. And so I think, whether it's Passkeys or other solutions that are rooted in public key cryptography, I think it's going to become more important in the years to come as a deterministic factor. Are you actually in possession of a key to prove you're a human or a particular human, as opposed to tools that are just trying to predict? And on that note, we saw recently a FIDO member roll out a solution that's specifically focused on deepfake detection. That's kind of novel. It was, hey, you'll have a passkey in the laptop you're using in Zoom, and we'll have a plugin into Zoom that actually says, okay, Joel, you say you're really here, but are you actually on the laptop that has had this passkey given to you by, your employer? And, you get a green check mark, or, maybe a red one if, there's a sign that you don't have the right key. So that's just, I saw this a couple of weeks ago, and, I won't say my jaw dropped, but I'm like, wow, that's just a novel use of this new technology that I didn't think I'd never anticipated. But they're building it in as a product that you can use to weed out deepfakes on Zoom calls.
And I love that too, for, for many purposes, but the purpose of like interviewing and hiring someone, especially when there was an example where, someone accidentally hired someone from North Korea hacker instead of who they thought they were hiring, for example. But I love that use case, because I do think, when everything is so increasingly remote, like, especially when you're trying to hire someone, you need to be able to, ensure that person's coming in as the same person every time, and be able to be assured of that. But you're not going to be able to do like a whole like identity check on someone that you haven't even hired yet, right? But you can leverage technology in order to ensure, it's not a deep fake, and also it's the same person coming in every time. And that, I loved that, because that was it's an ongoing conversation around like that whole like flow of like interviewing to hire. That's like one good use case for that too. And then I also love the call center use case. And, when it comes to like generative AI and folks, using that to impersonate via voice in the call center, that, passkeys and related technologies can really help there, because I don't really feel like call center employees are paid enough to have to determine whether or not they're being social engineered or not. So it's things like that, like Jeremy's talking about, these sort of like different cases where this technology can be applied to sort of combat some of these attacks that we're seeing.
Maybe we should see if there are any questions from the field at this point. And in the meantime, while we let people think, let's talk a bit about NIST. Jeremy, you were mentioning before the webinar started that NIST has started to explore passkeys. What's their stance? What are they saying about this technology?
So NIST, I would say, has been quite enthusiastic, to the point that they did something very unusual for NIST, which was they put out a supplement to their digital identity guidelines back in April, specifically around syncable authenticators, which is what passkeys are. NIST, I think look, this is a biometric update webinar, so there's probably a high nerd quotient on this. NIST is in the middle of a very comprehensive update of their digital identity guidelines, special publication 800-63 for those who, track NIST publication numbers. That's been going on for close to 2 years, and they just put out a new draft a few days ago that, will sort of be the final public draft. But their take was they were getting enough questions from government agencies, can we be using these things, particularly in public-facing applications, that they felt compelled to put out a supplement that basically clarified, yes, you can use them. Here's our recommendations on how you mitigate different, potential risks, tied to that was effective immediately. Because I think to channel what NIST said, they don't, think that they think it's an important enough innovation in the space that they don't want to have to wait another year before they say definitively in a final published document that, this is an okay thing for you to be using. So, in that regard, this supplement was, I think, really good to see, not only in the US government, but also, look, there's a lot of other governments across the globe that basically point back to the NIST digital identity guidelines, because there's really not any other government that does anything quite like them. or, they'll at least be heavily inspired by the work NIST does, and, their own guidance that they'll put out or their own standards that they'll set. So I think that has, also given, again, new technology, slightly different approach to security. People are going to be nervous. They always are. They don't want to be the lead zebra in the pack, lest they be the one that gets eaten by the lion. I think NIST coming out with an unusually strong show of support has, helped to address some of those things.
Excellent. We have a question from William Berry out there about a use case. What about a state verifiable ID wallet for law enforcement? Can either of you speak to that possibility?
So I need a clarification on that question. For law enforcement to use themselves to access systems, or that law enforcement could use to identify others? I can probably give an answer on both, but
I'm going to assume
I can do the Jeopardy music while we wait for the clarification.
Yeah, I'm going to assume it's for themselves and not to identify others, but that we don't.
Yeah, so on for themselves, what we've actually seen is CJIS, which is the FBI's Criminal Justice Information Systems regulations that govern the security requirements for accessing, essentially, federally, run criminal justice applications. For years, they've had their own kind of their own twist on authentication guidance, and they recently updated it to align largely with what NIST has said. And so in that regard, yeah, I think, that you could probably be using passkeys in some applications there. I will say NIST for enterprise use cases, noted a number of other controls you should have in place with passkeys, because the key material may be synced across a couple different devices, including things like, hey, if it's on a mobile device, make sure it's a managed device, that's using MDM, and make sure that the only people who have access to any key material are actually people who are authorized users of the system. Like maybe it's only your IT shop in, your law enforcement agency that should be able to access it. And so, without getting into everything that was laid out in the NIST supplement, I think they really anticipated use cases like law enforcement or other government enterprise use cases and laid out, okay, here's how you can actually start to use, say a built-in authenticator rather than one that is, so an external, sort of solution.
I don't know, William, if that answers your question. We had some clarification for law enforcement applications, but we'll assume that that's a satisfying answer. Before we're sort of, I think coming to the end of our questions, so unless there's anything else from the field, I just wanted to ask about timelines, projected timelines. If passkeys are inevitable, when will that inevitability come to pass in your best guess?
Well, geez. I mean, I think so. We're gonna be putting into place, like kind of a utilization tracking mechanism, so we can actually see what the mix is, right? So I think, we talk about like reducing reliance on passwords is kind of like our mission, or like getting rid of passwords. I think it's really like using passwords, right? So like, will a password exist? We don't want folks to like fall back on passwords. But I think a really, really interesting way to look at it is, we'll know when we've gotten there when someone entering a password is a risk signal. So, that's what's going to raise the flag and actually, make them have to step up and do more things rather than, their passkey. And in terms of timing, like I think, we've seen over the past, 2 years. Let's get to like, I'm not gonna commit to a timeline on that. But I think, year over year, we're going to see that mix becoming, passkey, passwords, passkeys, we're gonna surpass that. And I think that's when we're really there. And in terms of like meeting our objective, which is really, we talk about like getting rid of passwords, but it's really to have phishing resistant authentication be the status quo, like the most common way that we're signing in. So I'm hoping, I'm still not going to give a time frame, but you almost had me there, but I'm not going to do it.
Jeremy, try to stake a number.
I'd like to say by the end of 2026, I think passkeys are going to be the predominant way that people are being asked to authenticate when either signing up for a new account online, or they'll at least be available at most major public facing services in both government and industry. I mean, that may be optimistic, but again, I look at the adoption curve and, where we've gone from when this was really only announced, what was it, in 2022 at the RSA conference, as something that, within FIDO, the big tech platforms and other stakeholders were going to work to standardize on. So, I mean, we're like 2 years from the announcement, like really just a year or so from actual product being rolled out in platforms, and, adoption's been pretty rapid. So I'm optimistic on that front.
Wow, when you put it that way.
Excellent. And as you mentioned, fraud is not going anywhere. It continues in parallel with security efforts. So, we'll come back in 2026 and see where we're at.
See?
So I think that again, that wraps up the questions from me. I'll put one more call out to the field to see if anybody wants to chime in.
Yeah, we have one question that came in from an anonymous attendee that I actually think it'd be good to answer.
Okay.
Yeah, I think because it was,
right,
you
yeah.
had to scroll down.
It's just at the bottom there. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. To what extent are synced passkey factors such as automatic iCloud keychain syncing or the lack of robust attestation a concern to government agencies and other enterprises?
Good question.
So it's a great question. First, let me, the quick answer is a lot less than some people might think. But let's explain what we're talking about here as well. One of the novelties of passkeys, when we say synced passkeys, what we specifically mean is, the private key that's in, say, your iPhone will be synced through, say, iCloud keychain to your iPad or your Mac. It's going to be synced across the operating systems to the different devices that you have registered under your identity, which for those of us like me who came up in the old days of PKI, one of the things we talked about with private keys was don't ever clone and export a key, because that's bad security. The reason we're doing it now is I think everybody's come to realize that if we ever are going to try and truly kill the password and kill some of the legacy MFA that's also increasingly vulnerable and phishable, nobody knows how to do key management on the consumer side. Nobody wants to. If you explain this to them, they won't know what you're talking about and their head will explode or they'll walk away. And so a decision was made here to, okay, let's actually do something we said we wouldn't do, and which is starting to sync the keys across different devices through a secure sync fabric, like, the cloud services that are already used today to sync passwords across devices. So this was a bit of a doozy for some people in the security community to process. And I will, say there are some people who still aren't like fully on board with the idea. I think what has been really forward thinking here from what we've seen from NIST and other agencies. I mean, NIST kind of said it best in the supplement that they published in April. They said people are very worried about syncing, and we understand that. But the reality is that every other authenticator that's out there today that meets authentication assurance level 2, AAL2, the mid-range of what you need to do to, be considered good MFA, is also shareable. You can share an SMS code. You can share an OTP code. Or if you have an OTP app, the cryptographic keys that are used, to sort of, manage and generate those are often synced already between apps. If it's a push notification, you can be tricked into pushing it, which is effectively sharing it with somebody else. So they said passkeys, while they may be shareable, are no worse than anything else that's out there at AAL2, which is also shareable. And even better, they are phishing resistant, which none of those other technologies are. So, I often say in identity, nothing's perfect, but there are things that suck less than others, which is maybe a terrible tagline. But NIST was, sort of saying here, look, this isn't worse than anything else that's out there, which kind of sucks. And it's better because it's phishing resistant. Now, to be clear, that's for AAL2. If you want to get to AAL3, it has to be a device bound passkey that's on, a security key, say like a YubiKey. So there's going to be different levels of authentication that, depending on your security requirements, you might want to go with AAL3 and a hardware, security key where those keys aren't synced. But when it comes to, public-facing applications, or there's a lot of things even in the enterprise side where you don't need AAL3, passkeys are better than anything else that's out there at AAL2.
The related question, Megan, maybe you can take this one. Will passkeys replace FIDO hardware keys mid to long term?
No, and to be like, I know the terminology is what it is, but you can house passkeys on security keys. They're the FIDO credential, but they're bound to the device, right? So security keys are a physical thing that you need to have, buy and have. No, and I don't see that happening. And it's really because of what Jeremy just said. I mean, FIDO security keys are the gold standard for security. Like for me, I love saying passkeys, but my credential manager is locked down with a security key. Like no one's getting in there, right? So there are use cases where security keys and like to get to AL3, if you've got admins that need, a certain level of security, for example, or other stakeholders in your organization, FIDO security keys are the way to go. And I think that, it is not, and I think Jeremy just said this as well, on the enterprise side, internally side, workforce side, like it's not an all or nothing proposition. Meaning you do have folks who will need security keys. And you might have folks within your organization that still use passwords to sign into some stuff. So like those people should be using passkeys, synced passkeys, right? So I think it's really looking at like your use case and where, what privileges folks have and what levels of security they have today and where passkeys can fit into that. And I think security keys are a great technology innovation that we should be using, for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I'd agree with Megan. I think people have been, predicting the demise of hardware-based authenticators for years, and I really think they're going to be around for a long time because they're simply, there's security requirements that you can achieve with a purpose-built device that's not going to work on a multi-purpose device like a smartphone or a laptop, particularly in the enterprise side. I mean, look, I'm like Megan, I'm the channel Charlton Heston, you'll have to pry my YubiKey out of my cold dead hands. But most consumers don't want to carry a security key. But in the enterprise, it's much more common. And so, I think you'll see a mix of types of solutions where, in some cases you might, have a hardware key, like a security key. And in some cases you might use a passkey. You might even be using them, both in the same environment in some cases.
I want to step back. There was a question about accessibility of passkeys, insofar as it precludes or includes certain sectors of the population and their access to certain types of technology that is usable with passkeys. That seems a bit broad to me, but I mean, I guess certainly accessibility is an issue with any technological innovation. So what about passkeys?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think that that question in particular maybe was like you need like a certain smart device with like a operating system that is of a certain date, perhaps. And for that purpose, I mean, I think, when we talk about accessibility with passkeys, I'll get back to that part, but the accessibility piece is when we've done a lot of research also on the UX side with folks that have accessibility issues, whether it would be, they are blind or they have other issues where, they use screen readers. And to that point, passkeys are definitely more accessible than something like a password plus an SMS OTP. So we've done sort of that research in terms of like a general accessibility of, signing in through passkeys. I think that the technology piece of it is, I think, I don't have the statistics in front of me, but the number of devices that can leverage passkeys today definitely far surpasses the number of devices that are out there that can't, like by leaps and bounds. But I do think that there might be, those sorts of like edge cases or, things that we just have to deal with. I mean, I think, even if you have, a flip phone, with an operating system from whenever, we should be able to get to a point where you should be able to sign in through that as well. But that's kind of a work in progress kind of thing.
And I'll say accessibility from another perspective. People say, well, what if biometrics don't work for me? Because like there's always people who, especially depends on your device. Like if it's a fingerprint sensor, maybe it works for you sometimes, maybe it doesn't. You can always fall back to the PIN that you use to unlock the device. And so, and I think from a security perspective, most experts will say, a 6-digit PIN is roughly equivalent to, the level of accuracy you're going to get with most consumer grade biometric sensors and devices. There are some that are quite good and surpass that, but it's, not a bad fallback, much as if, on my phone, if, my biometric doesn't work, they say, well, enter the PIN instead. So you have that as an option. I will say this came up in the discussion we had with Michigan CTO, because, okay, so you can say, yes, if you've got a modern device and, operating systems up to date, and okay, maybe that takes care of 85% of your users. But look, if you're running a public facing website for government services and you've got somebody, rolling up, who's rocking a, ancient machine running Windows ME that somehow still hasn't collapsed yet, you have to have a way for them to log in. And so, yeah, passkeys are not going to work on that. But I do think also over time, I mean, look, I got a 5-year-old iPhone 11 and passkeys work great on it. And this is older than, what a lot of people are carrying. Maybe I'll, get excited and upgrade this fall. But, I think as people do modernize their devices, upgrade their devices, if you're looking forward, look, one of the great things about FIDO is because it's been universally embraced by the big platforms, you cannot buy a smartphone or tablet or laptop today that does not support FIDO out of the box. I mean, I guess you could if you do something custom, but I mean, anything you're going to get has support built into the operating system. The browser is supporting the WebAuthn standard, which is how you do FIDO in the browser. So any new device supports it. Devices going back quite a few years support it. And again, if you're thinking about, do I implement? Well, again, think about this point in time and where those users will be in 3 years or 5 years. Even the laggards are going to have done some sort of an upgrade at that point. And so I think the inability to support passkeys on certain devices will be much more of an exception than, it really just be a corner case at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and just one anecdote on that. So we just did, I think it's available on our website. I did a webcast with a company called Branch Insurance. And so they rolled out passkeys, but what their use case is, so they've got, insurance agents, sitting all over the world, right? And like mom and pop insurance agencies, right? So you running Windows primarily, but like, they don't know what, it could be to Jeremy's point, ME or whatever. But like, yeah, so that was a concern that they had as well, because they don't have like a great grasp on their base. And of course, like there could be older things, operating out in the field. And actually what they found was like 99% of their user base could use passkeys. And they were like very pleasantly surprised by that, because they were sort of concerned by that. But I think it's really to what Jeremy was saying is like most computing devices can do this. It's going to be hopefully like, and if it's not rare now, it'll soon to be very rare that the device could not do, could not let you sign in with passkey.
So we're almost at an hour. We're at the end of our questions for now. Certainly, I think that if anything, this webinar has shown me what you were mentioning early, which is that people have many, many questions about passkeys and the uptake and the speed with which they're getting out there is part of that. So it's a good thing, and certainly looks inevitable to me. So we'll continue to report on them, observe them, see how they roll out. And in the meantime, thank you again very much for your time today. Very much appreciate you coming and speaking with us and sharing your knowledge.
Thanks, Joel. Thanks for having us.
Appreciate the invite.
Had fun.
Thanks very much. Okay. With that, we will end.
Thanks to the audience too. Thanks for coming.